Hey there, so today's video is going to be focusing on the early metagame for Shadows of the Galaxy. The idea here is to get you prepped for your locals, prepped for the coming tournaments in the next few weeks, maybe the next month. Maybe you're going to Star City, Baltimore, maybe you're going to Gen Con. These are going to have some big events there. But regardless, wherever you go and wherever you play, there will be people playing decks that you should be prepared for. And we got a pretty big shakeup now with another set. So I'm going to go through a bunch of things and my early predictions. Before we get started, I'm really closing in on that 2K subscribers. So if you can take a moment and just click that subscribe button, it'll help out a ton. All right. So to start, what this is, it's the expected leaders I think, you're going to start seeing. The decks that they'll be spearheading, right? It's not just the list of what I think is good. It's also a list of things that I think will be played, right? So I keep tabs on like Discords, YouTube channels, reports from mini tournaments that are going on, right? I try to get as much information as I can to make my informed decisions. So this is kind of where I'm heading, like what I think you need to be prepared for. So it'll be a breakdown too of like archetypes. I'll have like call outs for specific cards from these decks that I think you need to kind of be aware of. A lot of them will be cards from the new set just because, you know, maybe you've already been prepped for cards from set 1, but you're not sure exactly what you're going to see in set 2. And also, there's going to be a lot of cards that I think demand very particular answers. There's a lot of weird stuff in this set, as you'll see, and there's certain cards that like demand a very specific counterplay to them, or you could just like end up losing the game on the spot. So I will try to highlight some of that stuff and how to deal with it. All right, let's get started. So number one, first thing we're going to talk about is Boba. Obviously, we always need to talk about this guy. Is it Boba time? Yeah, it's still Boba time. Right now, I think you can play Boba with any of these colors, and you'll have a good deck. So, what to do, how to counter this, what should you be prepared for based on which kind of Boba you might encounter. So, you know, we got the mono yellow. So, this is highlighted by Cunning in particular, right? That's the most powerful card in this deck. Maybe that and like Fett's Fire Spray, which goes into all the Boba decks. And we still got like Bodhi, we got Cantina Bouncer. We know the double yellow cards. So what's really new about Boba Yellow? Not much, right? Like there's just some new upgrades to the deck in terms of like card quality. There's there's a lot of various new cards that came out. A lot of them are events. So, you know, we've got like Hot Shot Blasters, New Adventure, Boba's Armor here, which is something I want to call out specifically because it does give Boba decks in general a different angle of attack. Now, I don't think it's an auto-include in Boba decks, but I think it's something you need to keep an eye on because a suited-up Boba can mean like game over for certain strategies if they're not prepared to deal with it, right? If the only way you're interacting with your opponent's board is through combat damage or unit-based damage or even like removal-based damage like open fire, you're just like never going to kill him, and he's going to kill you in like 2 turns, right? He's going to hit you for 6, and like with whatever else they had, like that could just mean game over. So I think you need to be kind of aware, right? Upgrade removal is important. Rival's Fall in this case could be a good answer to Boba. Power the Dark Side, right? If you're able to clear up the rest of their board. Setting up a board state that you're able to do a bunch of damage to him before he gets suited up. It's just things you need to be aware of. Other than that, the deck itself remains at its core kind of unchanged. There's just going to be some new cards. We'll talk about the Phantom Tie in a moment because it's a card that's going to go create a bunch of different situations, but it is a card that could be in this deck too, so you might need to be prepared for that. Forlom, Zuckuss are cards that could start showing up in Boba Fett. So 4 power ambush on 4 is something you need to look out for. Zuckuss as a follow-up, right? He's a giant beater, so cards that beat giant beaters, right? Fell the Dragon is pretty good right now. Overruling Barrage obviously is something that can deal with something like that at times. Sentinels do not help there, right? Because he's Saboteur. So just different things you need to be thinking about. Boba Yellow is still very strong. I don't know if it's the best pair for Boba right now, but I certainly think it's going to get played a bunch, so be on the lookout. All right, next up, we'll talk about Boba Red. So my buddy Justin from KTOD actually just made a video about a Boba Red deck, highlighting Triple Dark Raid and Ruthless Raider, as well as like the Lurking Tie, because, you know, we'll talk about the Lurking Tie right now. Card's really obnoxious to deal with for a lot of decks. The best way to deal with it is just to have a space unit in play, right? They can't really play a 2/2 for 3 if you've got a space unit that can kill it. So that's the easiest way, right? If you were playing a control deck in Villain and you weren't playing Inferno 4s or weren't playing 3 Inferno 4s, maybe you're going up to 3. Maybe you were thinking about cutting Star Vipers or not playing like Black Sun, the Sentinel ship. Those are cards that are pretty good there. Heroes have plenty of cheap space units, A-Wings, Restored Arcs. There's Kylo's ship, there's Mercenary Gunship. Like, the answers are there, they just need to be in your deck, because if this gets played and that gets buffed up by something like a TIE Advanced, or later, if it gets played like a Tarkin deck and gets buffed up past its 2 health, and you can't kill it anymore, removal's not going to do you any good, right? The only clean one for it is Make an Opening, which I think is a good card right now. But yeah, just like be aware of Lurking Tie. The more popular it is, the more you need to respect it and be ready for it on turn 2. So Boba Red, what is it doing differently from some of the other Bobas? I mean, primarily I think it's doing Ruthless Raider. Ruthless Raider is a really good card, especially against control decks, especially if you're cheating it out. And this deck probably has the best package of Triple Dark Raid because of that, right? It still gets to do Fire Spray as all the other ones do, but it gets Ruthless Raider also. And that makes Triple Dark Raid extremely potent in this deck. Triple Dark Raid is good with a bunch of ships too, right? Like TIE Advanced onto a Lurking Tie. You get to bounce the TIE. The TIE Advanced actually will just go back to your hand after that turn, which could be useful for you as well. Red will also give you removal if you need it. So this is a cool deck. Boba, as you can see, is just a really strong thing to be doing kind of all the time, and he enables a bunch of different options and colors, and this is one of them. So just keep an eye out on Boba Red. Boba Green. So what is Boba Green doing? It's playing Super Laser Tech and Overwhelming Barrage, right? Like, that's its angle is the ramp into Overwhelming Barrage, into like Maul or Vader. That's how it's different than a bunch of these other versions. It's got Entry Conversion Lab. I'm not sold on it being one of the better versions right now. I just still think it's going to be played. I mean, there's people who bought Vaders, who bought Bobas, and they're going to play the deck that they can play. I think this deck is still very good. Just because I don't think it's the best version of Boba right now doesn't mean it's not good. Maul gives it much more like closing potential than Vader did, right? Vader is a fantastic card, but in an aggressive deck like this, if you can maul in and like deal like 4 or 5 overwhelm damage and leave behind a giant unit, that could be enough to turn the tide. Versus Vader gives you more time, gives your opponent more time to respond to him, even though he brings out 2 units. So yeah, like, be ready for this. There's not much new here that you really need to think about outside of Maul, right? Like, if you're playing against this deck, you should have in the back of your mind that they can overwhelm you at the 7 resource. Like, oh, you've got that 1 resource left. Do you play Greedo? Do you play your 2 health 2 drop just because you can? Maybe not, because maybe you'll just die to Maul, or maybe you're going to enable a much more potent Maul than you should be. And lastly, Boba Blue. So this is a control deck. Talk about, right after this, the other kind of hard control decks, but he kind of spearheads that strategy. The blue-yellow hard control. Sometimes it's mono blue, sometimes it's blue-red, but basically it's Super Laser Blast. It's a bunch of events. It's Bounty Hunter Cruise. It's Restocks and Vigilance, right? It's that deck. Enticing Reward is a really, really powerful card in this strategy. One thing this deck does struggle with sometimes is that for the majority of the game, it's trying to play 1-for-1 until it can start looping like Bounty Hunter Cruise or get a very potent Super Laser Blast out. But Enticing Reward does let it accrue some card advantage. Also, the Search 10 to bring 2 cards. It's wild how good, like, how many options you're going to have for the exact moment you need them. So enticing reward, look at that. We're going to mention upgrade removal in general as being something that I think is on the rise in necessity. So cards like Disabling Fang Fighter, Confiscate, Aggression in mono red. You're going to need some ways mostly to deal with upgrades, and it's going to be pretty important in this strategy. But yeah, like the Boba, if you've encountered this deck, the core again is pretty unchanged, but enticing reward gives it a pretty good angle. Cloud Rider, the 3/1 ambush unit for 2, is another like pretty big get for this strategy because it lets them kind of prevent damage early in the game. It's a 2-cost removal, something that the deck doesn't really have. So yeah, like this is very powerful. It does plan on playing long games, and this is probably my vote for the best of the hard control decks, although we'll talk about a few other options right now. So that's these, like I think mono blue Iden, blue Vader, and blue Afra are all like variations of this same deck, okay? It's like the restock vigilance stuff. Whereas Iden, I think, probably is a bit better into aggro decks just because her leader does the healing. I think that's like what you're going to angle with if you're trying to do Iden, like mono blue or blue red. Vader, I think it's probably not anymore the best, although it was the one that kind of like spearheaded this movement. I remember when it took down Orlando 5K by Guy Cohen with a blue-red Vader deck that kind of obliterated a bunch of Bobas to get to the finals. Afra is the most similar one here to the Boba deck. Question you have to ask yourself is, should I play Afra instead of Boba? Boba's the giant body. Boba's the one that lets you like removal into ready resources into like deploy something. What does Afra do? Well, Afra draws you a card on flip, which is pretty strong. We talked about how attrition is or like running out of cards can be a problem for that deck because it's trying to trade 1-for-1 a lot. And additionally, her leader side, where it's constantly discarding cards, does benefit you in some matchups where you're trying to get to an endgame state quicker, to enable your restocks to be more powerful, to enable your bounty hunter crews more effectively. So there is an angle there for her. I do think Boba is the better version of the deck, but I think you can try it out with Afra as well, and some people might, so you need to look at that. As far as like the deck archetype itself, I mean, in jest I kind of call it double Lost City. Yeah, you need to know if you're playing a hard control deck and playing mirrors, you need to be quick with your deck, and you need to find ways to close out games so that you don't end up in situations where you're stuck in a game 3 that no one's going to finish. All right, blue-green control. So this is an amazing archetype. It was in set 1. I thought it was maybe the best overall deck in set 1. I took down a 1K with a Krennic green right at the end of set 1's lifespan. The general strategy is pretty similar, but there is some notable changes here. And I think Kira, number 1, is the biggest one. I think she is way better than Krennic or Iden at this archetype. I can't imagine she's not the best version of the deck. It might not turn out to be that way, but right now it's where my head's at. You need to be ready to deal with Kira, right? So it's a much different like flip than a lot of people have played into. And if you have Kira across from you and you just like blindly like deploy your Boba and she flips and trades with him, that's a huge win for her. Thinking that, oh, you'll just hold up like takedown or some removal and kill her, and thinking you're going to be ahead after her flip is foolish, because she gets almost all of her value just from the flip going off, not so much from her unit side being around. So be ready to kind of like have to play chicken with her leader sometimes. You need to try to find a way to minimize that flip. It will often just cause you to trade leaders with her, and it's something you'll have to live with. But there are some cards like Forlom out of a Boba deck. If you're able to hold up resources and force her flip, can be an interesting card to trade with her. It's just hard sometimes to get those resources to line up. I think Aggression, the double red card, actually is probably pretty strong here as being able to kill her and give you some card advantage. So keep practicing and learning how her flip stuff works. The shields, too, in the long game are going to make her a pain for you to deal with if you're playing a blue-green deck that doesn't have it, like Krennic or Iden. I don't know how they're going to be able to deal with the fact that their leaders are so much worse than hers in the late game, because your Vaders and Avengers and Gideons and whatever you're playing all come with shields attached to them. And yeah, so there's a lot of reasons why I think she's just better right now, and why I think you need to be prepared to deal with her, because it plays a lot differently than the set 1 leaders. Other notable cards. So Make an Opening, I think, is an all-time high right now. We talked about the TIE Phantom. It answers that. It answers 7th Fleet Defender. It's just like interestingly been really good outside of just cards like that. It also gets turbocharged in Kira because she can, once again, have everything's health, putting a lot of things in Make an Opening range. Snoke is an absolute bomb of a finisher for any of these blue decks. You need to find a way to either know that you can win after a Snoke comes down like almost immediately, or have answers to him, because you are not winning like unit-based games anymore once he's in play. Even things like Maul can't kill him straight up, so you're gonna have to find ways to either like hurt him or just have straight removal for him. Bounce for him, but the bounce will only be good if you're then able to push a bunch of damage immediately and then like close out a game, because he's just going to come right back down. He prevents so much damage. I think he's a pretty clear upgrade to Reinforcement Walker outside of maybe into hard control decks, because the Reinforcement Walker can't draw you cards. But the 3 health that the Walker would gain is much less impactful than the amount of damage Snow can prevent with that -2/-2. And the last one I want to shout out here is Client. Again, it's not a card that you're always going to see in these decks, but it can really just slam the door sometimes on unit-based damage. If blue-green has started to stabilize against you and has a Client in play, it makes it really hard to ever play units again, because all your units will just read your opponent gains 5 life. So aggro decks are going to need to look at more burn out of their hand to close out games against the Client than they might have otherwise needed in the first place. The other thing they might need to do is actually kill him, which is hard. He comes with a shield. He's got a lot of health. But a Poe, for instance, can ambush into a Client, use his ability to kill that shield and kill him, which is something that like a Sabine deck might need to do, because otherwise, if that Client's in play, a lot of their damage potential gets mitigated. All right, speaking of Sabine, is it still real? The answer is yes, I think it's still real. I think green is the best version still, right? I thought green was the best version in set 1. I still think it's the best version. I think now more people are on board with it being the best version though, so might not be as unique of a take anymore. But what are the changes? Well, the changes are they can go a bit bigger. Poe and Wreck are absolutely disgusting energy conversion lab targets. You can even play something like Timely Reinforcements in your Sabine deck to get more ambushes out of your chunky units. Dark Saber is probably the most unique card for Sabine now, because a turn 3 Dark Saber Sabine means game over for a lot of decks if they weren't ready for it. So again, upgrade hate might be more important. Ways to deal with Sabine on deploy, or at least get a bunch of damage onto her that turn so that you can finish her off the next turn, right? I think you can deal with her attacking you 1 time with that Dark Saber, but if she gets 2 hits in, that's just probably game over. So have in your head, okay, if turn 3 Sabine is coming out before they play any resources, there's a good chance that a Dark Saber is coming out too. You might need to play like some pass chicken to make sure that they can't just freely deploy, because if you play out your cards and they know the coast is clear for that Dark Saber, you can be in a world of hurt. So Darksaber definitely gives a new angle for this deck. The play line is similar to the Wing Leader stuff, except it's just so much more damage up front that you get less time to react. Poe and Wrecker are fantastic cards, not just in Sabine, but I think Poe especially to like replace Steadfast is pretty big. It can kill the same way that like Steadfast could, but Steadfast needed Sabine out. Poe can kill most leaders on his ambush. He can also push a bunch of damage, right? A Poe that survives to attack can represent 8 damage. Wrecker, on the other hand, also with his Overwhelm, we know how good K2 is with his Overwhelm. Wrecker is like a K2 on steroids when it comes to being able to push damage the turn it comes into play. So these are new things you need to be aware of that Sabine will likely be packing. I don't like the yellow version of Sabine will probably not want to play these cards because without Energy Conversion Lab, they become way less good. Sabine Green does tend to go a little bigger and has the potential to do a lot more damage with that and gets timely reinforcements to even double dip on these ambushes. So Coast is never really clear against them, right? Oh, they used Energy Conversion Lab, they have 6 resources. I feel good. No, Poe can come out and ambush you again for 6 resources with that card. Sabine, red, well, we'll talk about mono red in a second. So yeah, this is a real deck. You got to eat your vegetables and pack anti-aggro stuff or you will get run over. All right, mono red. So shameless plug, I did do a mono red Han deck video, so go check that out. I think mono red has a lot of play. Personally, I think mono red Han is better than mono red Sabine. Mono red Sabine is likely quicker, but what I like about Han is that he can play Poe and Wrecker much more effectively than Sabine can, right? I don't think mono red Sabine would even play Poe and Wrecker. It's very slow to just play them out like fair versions of them, but Han can cheat them both out for 4 resources and 5 resources respectively, so that's why I prefer him. But why are we playing mono red? Primarily we're playing mono red because of aggression. I've already mentioned it a few times during the course of this video. I think it's at that card is very good right now. Upgrades are everywhere. The damage, the 4 damage from it is very relevant. It's very flexible card. Like you would think a card like this might not be good into control, but the fact that it draws you a card means that it's netting you resources, it's netting you value, even against control decks. It helps in racing situations because of the readying. And yeah, it gives you outs to things that you might not have had outs to do because upgrade stuff can often blow you out, but this blows them out, right? Bounties, shields, experience tokens, traitorous, lightsabers, right? Like Darksaber. So aggression, I think, is very good. Bo-Katan, right? It's not some like magical card, but it might be the best 2-drop in the game right now. You get, like in Han 2, you get Wild Rancor, which I think, again, is not something I'd play out of mono red Sabine, but for 5 resources, that 6/6 Overwhelm that deals 2 to everything is quite a beating. So I think mono red deserves to be on this list. This might be my own bias, but I think the deck is very good. I think mono red Sabine can also do burn better than some of the other decks because not only do you get 4 cause, you can play Chaos of War, which is more out of hand damage. Combine that with things like Daring Raid and K2, which can do burn damage. Reckless Gunslinger, which is that 2/1 that has the smuggle that does 1 damage to both players when it comes into play. The deck can have a lot of reach, and especially it can have some reach without playing units, which is something very interesting if you expect to see a lot of clients around, because you can just stop playing units and they can just sit there and the client will have nothing to do, and you'll draw into your 9 burn events, right? Daring Raid, Chaos of War, 4 cause, and you might just be able to kill your opponent, get that last point of damage without having to play a unit and give that client food. All right, let's talk about Bossk. So I put up this tweet here, which I thought was a little funny. I'm doing this mostly in jest. It's a little small, on the screen, but it's from one of the devs that they said that Bossk was primarily built for draft because they didn't think that a lot of upgrades and bounties would lead to in the deck would lead to like a very like well constructed premier deck. I mostly disagree with this though. I actually think Bossk is pretty strong. It's something to look out for. Bounty Hunter's Quarry in particular is a really powerful bounty. I think it's the best one. There's also the Enticing Reward, which we talked about in the yellow. I don't think that one is quite as good in a boss deck, although it is a very good bounty. The other ones, right, we got Guild Target, you got the Ramp Bounty, there's, what else? There's the Draw Bounty, there's the neutral one that gives experience. Like, these are all decent, especially with Bossk, right? The whole idea with the bounties is Bossk gives you free damage, so you can kind of accrue that card advantage for free without having to spend time or units, or as much time or units to actually trigger these bounties. What makes Bossk go off, right? You got Django, tremendous with bounties. Punishing one to be able to push sometimes 6 damage in a turn. Also very powerful. Bossk himself getting a double trigger on like a Bounty Hunter's Quarry can just overwhelm your opponent. And this deck, I think, would function on a different angle than some others, right? But we talked about how important upgrade hate, and it does hit this deck really hard. Aggression in particular, right? Like killing 2 bounties, potentially killing a unit could actually just close out a game sometimes. But I think things like Fang Fighter could also pose a little bit of a problem for a deck like this. But because this attacks on a unique angle, it is something that you need to be like practiced for if you are expecting to encounter it. I don't know how popular it's going to be, but I think it's a decent deck and something to look at. All right, what's the deal with Ray? So Ray, from what I can tell, is very popular. So we're going to talk about it. I don't think this deck is amazing, personally. I think it does some cool stuff. I don't think it's as good as a lot of the decks we talked about already, but it doesn't really matter what I think, because if someone else thinks it's good, they're going to play it, and you need to be ready for it and what it does. So number one thing it does is discard your cards. So these decks are typically playing Force Throws, they're playing Pillages, they're going to play K2 and like other incidental discard, maybe Poe. I don't think Poe is great in this deck, but it could be there. So that's one thing you need to be aware of. You need to be aware that your hand could be getting stripped. You sometimes need to keep more cards in your hand, not just blindly deploy resources or deploy units that might not be that effective. Sometimes we'll need to hold back resources to counter this stuff. This is still kind of like a Force deck, similar to how Churret was. It doesn't do the Force stuff nearly as well as Churret, just because, you know, Churret was an invincible Force user that came out on 5 resources. But Luke, Kanan, Yoda, these are cards that are often here. Now, what else is Ray doing is the buff stuff, right? It does make some units that are typically not top tier or not that scary much more powerful, right? Like I think the most powerful thing this deck can do is play a turn 1 R2 and turn it into a 2/5. The following turn, it can make it into a 3/6. It can be pretty annoying. A lot of the units in this deck function much better with that experience, right? Like Yoda becoming a 3/5, Restored Arc becoming a 3/4, Moisture Farmer, right? This is the only deck that can run Moisture Farmer, not ironically. And it's kind of the only thing I think that makes it sometimes survive Sabine decks. I don't think this deck is actually very good into like that Sabine green deck we were talking about, but a turn 1 Moisture Farmer can certainly flip that. And if you're playing aggro and you see a Moisture Farmer, my advice to you is to kill that before that thing becomes like a 2/6 or 3/7 or whatever they're going to do with it, because 2 health a turn is going to buy them so much time. Additionally, you know, Ray has that built-in restore, so if they're able to stabilize before like that turn that she deploys and they can start getting that 3 health a turn, that's when aggro really gets out of reach. I think the discard strategy in general is better into Boba than I had originally anticipated. especially like Boba Green that plays ramp, but could hit the Boba Yellow stuff too. And the control decks obviously don't like getting cards discarded. So I think that is an angle that is powerful for this deck. I think it's like it is the thing that's separating it from a lot of other strategies, is that discard angle. The force stuff, if you're playing against this deck and you have ways to remove force units cleanly, it's something you should prioritize. Force throw is still a bomb of a card, and forces with me too if they play it. These are very powerful things, but if you shut off their force enablers, you can make their hands really clunky sometimes. Now, is this better than Churret, the Churret version of this deck? I'm actually not sure. I know Churret kind of like Rivals Fall came out and everyone thinks Churret isn't a real thing anymore, or doesn't deserve even being tested. I'm not sure this is even better than a Churret version playing like the same core, but it might be. And certainly if like Ray's ability is very different and enables a much different kind of like unit core than a Churret deck would. All right, Old Man Han. So this is still going to be around. It's another deck that, in my personal opinion, was not as good as a lot of people thought it was. I think it was very good. I just thought it was unfavored in set 1 into Boba and the blue-green villain control decks, and I had a hard time justifying playing a deck that I thought was unfavored against those two. But it's getting buffed this set for sure, so we'll talk about some of the stuff that makes it different now. So first of all, Spark of Hope is more ramp. Now, Resupply was very good in this deck. It turned on some of the most busted openings for Han, and Spark of Hope giving it more like opportunities to do those power plays, I think is pretty important. Also want to talk briefly about this Tech DJ stuff. I'm sure you've seen lots of videos about this combo. In case you haven't, really quickly, so Tech makes DJ a 5 resource smuggle. He normally would be 7 in double yellow, but Tech kind of overrides that. So you can play Tech as early as turn 2 in this deck, and as early as turn 3 with Han's ability, get a DJ out. Now, what is so good about that in this deck in particular is because Han's ability lets you blow up any resource you control at the end of the turn. You can actually blow up the resource you stole, basically permanently ramping you and permanently destroying one of your opponent's resources. So it's the only deck that can really like capitalize on that DJ steal in that way, and it is a strong play. Now, I don't think it's like game warping. I think it's very telegraphed, and I think it has like you can play around it, but the cost of including these two cards in your Han deck isn't very high. DJ at its baseline is still just a 3/5 for 3, which is fine, and Tech, I think, is a card you would probably want 1 or 2 copies of in your Han deck, because this deck loves playing long attrition-y games, and Tech is a long attrition-y card. So these cards are probably just going to be in the Han deck because of the off chance that you can do some giant power play with them and sometimes steal a game. So look out for that, right? Be aware that this could happen to you so that you can play around it. The other stuff Han does really well is attrition, right? Like U-Wing, giving it potentially 3-for-1 card at value, Home 1. Like these are cards that are generating card advantage, right? Bright Hope too. So Han, even though he uses his resources sometimes recklessly, ends up in a lot of game states where he has a full grip of hand because of all those cards. So how do you deal with that? I think discard actually hits Han really hard, because their card advantage stuff doesn't come online until later in the game, and they typically have to have slightly less cards in their hand building up to that, especially if they're trying to ramp with Han's ability. So discard, like Pillage and Force Throw, if you can like empty their hand really quickly, it's going to make it hard for them to like really gain traction and get into their endgame state. Boba also has typically been able to just kind of aggro this stuff out, especially like the mono yellow version, just by pushing a bunch of damage, making it difficult for them to deploy their leader into a Boba Fett. So those are things to look out for too. Yeah, that's what I got about Han. All right, just want to brief call outs on a few other things. So Tarkin, I've seen this Tarkin yellow deck that really wants to capitalize on the Phantom tie by buffing it up with Tarkin and tie advance and kind of stealing games like that. So I think it's just something you need to be aware of that's going to get played. I think this deck is going to be pretty popular because it's like unique and cool. Bounce, in my mind, would absolutely obliterate this deck. So like a mono yellow Boba, like I don't know how Tarkin deals with a mono yellow Boba, but there are some decks that are really going to struggle with that buff stuff. It's also a really good overwhelming barrage deck, again, because of those buffs. Darth Vader, like Darth Vader green, like classic Vader, I think is still a good deck. It's gonna be, it's gonna take some time to like figure out how to like best build that for like potentially being able to steal games from aggro. But it is something to look at. Palpatine. Now I haven't messed with Palp yet. I really usually need to see, like it's like the controlliest of control, especially like controlliest of like the not hard control vigilance restock stuff. But I think it's gonna be hard to build Palp without getting a clear idea of the metagame. I think control in general is harder to build. I think Palp even more so, just because of how weak he is against aggro in the first place. I think I'm gonna wait a little bit on Palp before I can like really determine what I need to target. Grand Inquisitor is another one that I think has some more potential. I made a video about mono yellow Grand Inquisitor, which I think can like OTK with a bunch of like wasted actions with like shielded units and stuff and cheap cards. It's a fun deck. People might play it. Yeah, and Chirrut. I want to talk about Chirrut just for a second here because, you know, I really like this guy. I still think the deck's pretty decent. Like I said with the Ray stuff, I think you can take a lot of the stuff that's being used in Ray into Chirrut. I mean, Chirrut was kind of doing it first anyway, right? Like the whole discard strategy stuff was the Chirrut deck. It was mostly a post-board plan, but Pillage does give it more of a main deck angle. Now, where I think Chirrut struggles with the most right now is actually not Boba, it's Sabine. I think the additions of like Poe and Wrecker and Darksaber into Sabine decks are made a matchup that used to be much more even, much more difficult now. As well as if you're starting to include things like Pillage and K2 in your main decks here, your equity against that Sabine deck is going to go down even further. But I'll be working on Chirrut. I still think he's good. I think I would play him Chirrut Red over Ray Red right now. I think you're going to steal games more with Chirrut. You're going to be able to close out games against control much quicker, so you can still do that discard stuff. But this deck style will represent more damage quicker. So yeah, this little call out for my friend. All right, and just a few call outs on some individual cards. I just wanted to put a few things that didn't really fit into any of the other like images yet, but like Spark of Rebellion, I think right now you're going to see that primarily in like the Han deck, but I think it's again going to be a card that you'll start seeing play more and more as like the meta evolves. It's a very good card, and in the same light, Bazine Natal, I think you need to look at this card carefully, especially if you're playing against Villain Yellow, because if you're going second and you think they might have Bazines in their deck, it's going to change the way you need to resource in the early turns. You might no longer be able to keep only 1/2 drop because you could end up losing your turn 1 play. Potentially, if you only have 1 follow-up play, that could be a problem. So you need to like maybe look at hands that have more follow-ups. In general, she's very sneaky, right? Like normally we say like, hey, like let's do our actions in play more before we play cards from our hand. Like let's attack with our units, use our leader before we like have to commit resources into the game. But if you're sitting in your hand and you've got like 1 card that you absolutely need to play this turn, you like, I have to play this Luke this turn. Now I have a bunch of other actions, I prefer to do them, but if you end up getting your Luke sniped after you like attacked with something because they played Bazine, that could be a huge problem. So you might need to change your play patterns a little bit, especially if this card becomes more popular. No Good to Me Dead. Why is this here? It's because you shouldn't be cutting this from your decks. It's very good. I've seen lists trimming on this card or cutting it completely. Don't do it. Play it. Like, I know we got a bunch of flashy new toys, especially in like Yellow Villain. Like, there's a bunch of new events. You can fill your Boba decks with a bunch of these like cool, fun cards. But like No Good to Me Dead and Shoot First are still very good, and you should be playing them. Rivals Fall, new removal. It's the catch-all. We talked about how early I said like this card coming out made people think Churret was unplayable. I don't think it makes Churret unplayable, but I think it's an important card that you'd be considering, especially if you're going to be suiting up leaders. Like, this is a good answer to like the Boba armor on the Boba Fett. And it's just a card that I think you should have in the back of your mind when you're playing against blue and not overcommit in such a way that you can get blown out by it. Toro is another interesting card that you might see getting played in Boba decks or Bossk decks. He can represent an absolute absurd amount of damage if he gets buffed. Think mono yellow playing Cunning, buffing it by 4, attacking for 7, then playing some Bounty Hunter and readying him again. You get hit for 14. Right? I think you need to be prepared for that. You also just need to be prepared for him hitting you for 3 and then 3, right? Like, it's a pretty flexible card. His floor is really high just because he's a 3/5. So it's a card that I wanted to shout out here. And lastly, Traitorous. I wasn't really playing this in very many decks in set 1. I think its value right now is higher, especially because of that Phantom Tie. But also, like, you know, if people are playing Tarkin and buffing units, it's pretty good. It's pretty good against Ray Red because she's going to buff some of her early 1 and 2 drops, and you can like steal. And even like if they buff a 2-drop or a 3-drop once, you're basically not even like losing resources on the play. You're just getting like 4 resources of their value and stealing it. So you huge value when you can steal a buffed unit with Traitorous. Yeah, like I think it's just a card you need to look at. And then at the same time, if you are playing one of those strategies that's buffing units, you need to be probably packing some upgrade hate so you don't get blown out by this. So the Ray Red probably needs to play the same with Fang Fighter. Same with like the Boba Red. If they're playing Phantom Ties or like the Tarkin Green, the Tarkin Yellow, probably a little harder to deal with this in those colors. But yeah, it's a card I wanted to shout out. All right, that's it. Those are my meta predictions. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I missed any decks. Let me know if you disagree completely about any of my takes on any of these decks. It's all great to hear. There's a couple things to look out for in this channel. I'll definitely be doing something with Kira, hopefully in the near future, but I want to really hone that down before I put out a video on her. Might dabble with some Churret if I can get it to a place that I feel comfortable with. But yeah, I'll also be doing a bunch of other stuff. And yeah, stay tuned. Please subscribe. And until next time, take care.